Welcome everybody. My name is Bob Latino. I will be your co-host today. My colleague LaRonda, as many of you know, she'll be here shortly. I want to introduce our speaker of the day. Our presentation is going to be Adventures in Safety, Choose Your Own Safety Adventure. To give you a little bit of background about Ben, but if you've met Ben before, this is you know this is going to be a memorable experience. But I will go ahead and read the script anyway. Ben Goodheart is an organizational performance, safety, and leadership professional with over 30 years of experience. His diverse career began in the aviation industry, and his varied operational expertise affords him a variety of opportunities to practice his passion. Today, Ben collaborates with businesses in the verticals of aviation, healthcare, public utilities, chemical processing, oil and gas, and others to design human-centered organizational systems that are resilient, safe, and effective for the people they serve. Ben's an active author, speaker, and researcher focused on safety management and organizational climate and culture, and with a specific focus on building strong, flexible organizations through leadership and human-centered design. Ben holds a master's in science.
Oh, it just keeps going, Bob.
I know.
That's probably good enough,
This
isn't
is
it?
the short version.
Holy smokes.
And I'll end with Ben is the founder of Magpie Human Systems, and I don't really think I need to introduce who Ben is because, like I said, if you've met him before, you know this is going to be an experience and this will be fun. And go ahead and take it over, Ben.
Appreciate it, Bob. Thank you. This is put on, by the way. I'm going to assume you didn't just show up at a link surprised that you were here, but this is put on by the Community of Human and Organizational Learning. Holy smokes, what a cool group. If this is your first time being a part of one of these, you need to hang out more often. If you're not going to be in Columbus in June, ordinarily Columbus, Ohio in June is probably not a bucket list item, but the Community of Human and Organizational Learning annual conference is going to be there in June, and you ought to go. It's crazy good. It is probably the best kept secret in this kind of business. There are some really cool people there. Trust me, go there. And you get to hang out at the Ohio State University a little bit too, if that's your thing. But thanks so much for that group and everything that they do. This is pretty stinking cool. As Bob said, and it was a really long sort of made up introduction, I think. Sounded like a lot anyway. But I'm Ben Goodheart. I own a little company called Magpie Human Systems. The only reason that that's important, I think anyway, is that we get a chance to work with folks all over the world, hundreds of different organizations all over the world. And I'll tell you maybe a little bit about how I got here. As Bob mentioned, I started in aviation. Aviation is one of those things I would call a high consequence industry. You'd probably agree. The consequence of failure is pretty spectacular, not in a great way. And I thought a lot about that. When you're in the pointy end of an aircraft, you have a lot of time to think about things. It sounds like you should be busy, but honestly, you're just sitting there kind of hanging out and talking to people most of the time. And so you have a lot of time to think. And I got to thinking about this safety thing. I started out in the airport world. I was doing ground handling after that, and eventually got into flying airplanes and working on airplanes a bit. It's an interesting place to be because the word safety gets thrown around an awful lot. And I got excited about it. I had a background in engineering, and I thought, boy, I'm going to get into this thing. And in about 1997, I started in safety proper as an accident investigator. If you've never done accident investigation, I wouldn't sprint over to do it. I found it sort of depressing. I'm a delicate flower, though, and your mileage may vary. But I didn't like the sense that we only showed up after something pretty awful had happened. tried to decode it, and then it's just a wash, rinse, repeat. It felt to me like we did that over and over and over, and the same thing happened. The other thing that didn't quite make sense to me is we liked to, and everybody did at the time. I'm going to use that kind of crappy excuse. Like, well, everybody was doing it. We blamed people a lot. There's this thing of, failure to maintain situational awareness or human error, or somebody made a poor decision given the information that they had. And while that's fun, if you're just trying to close out an investigation, it's not all that helpful. And so I kept looking for a little bit uh, different things to do. And I got introduced to by some folks who were at Department of Defense and NASA to what was at the time called system safety. That was a pretty big thing to do. System safety, human factors, ergonomics, and that felt pretty stinking cool. It was a little different than trying to kick around the remnants of an accident, but it still felt pretty mechanical. We were doing event trees and fault tree analysis, uh, and you could draw those things on as many pieces of paper as you could find, and still things go wrong, right? It didn't capture, well, it didn't make sense anyway to me. Um, because it didn't capture the things that change so often during a day at work. So I sort of puttered around a little bit more. And at the time in Europe, especially in the aviation world, there was this thing called safety management systems. And in the US, it was sort of less exciting maybe than it was on the European side of things, where they were really getting into systems level thinking. And folks like Eric Holnagel were writing white papers and circulating these things around. Really stinking cool stuff. So, all that is to say, I was thinking about this whole choose your own adventure thing, mostly because all cultural references that I have stop in the 80s. It's A Team and Knight Rider and apparently Choose Your Own Adventure books. But it sort of felt like that to me, this winding path through trying to figure out safety. I'm not sure that adventure is over, but we'll try to add a little some of it, I guess, today. So I have something to ask. Hopefully you'll help me out. There's a chat associated with this thing, which I cannot see, but Bob can.
It would be
I'm
on,
pretty sure.
it would be on the lower panel
I'm
option.
sure it is. Oh boy. Um, Dating myself here. Okay, excellent. I can see it, but Bob, I'm going to ask and LaRonda to help me out a little bit here because we have choices. It's in the title, the whole choose your own adventure thing. So I haven't snuck that up on you. So, choose your own adventure book, if you're not familiar, exists in a time when there were books and people read them. You would go into this thing and you'd read a few pages, and it might say, you choose to open this door or read this map. If you choose this, turn to page 43. If you choose this, turn to page 28. And you sort of navigate your way through this book in different ways based on your choices. That seemed pretty cool, mostly because I couldn't decide on a topic for this webinar. Um, so part of our social construct, I hope, is that you'll hop in the chat because I'm going to ask you here pretty shortly which direction you'd like to go. Now, our promise was we would at least make things hop adjacent. So I'll try to keep it that way. But feel free. I would love it if you would just unmute yourself every once in a while too. If you have a question, that works out fine for me. I don't know if Bob allows that,
Yeah,
but
Ben, I'll go ahead and I'll keep track of the and I should have said that in the beginning. I'll keep track of the chatting, and if anybody wants to unmute, just go ahead because Ben's open to not waiting till the end, but just go ahead as we go. Sorry.
I think if we wait till the end, it's going to be weird. So let's get into it. Let's choose this adventure. So I've picked hyperspace because I thought number one, it's kind of a weird illustration here. What appears to be Chevy Chase sort of in an unflattering drawing on the front of the book here, and space aliens, and also, so we got it all. But here's our entrance, right? And if you can't see your screen because you're driving or something like that, I'll read it to you. So here's how we start. Your tiny craft sits down with a sharp jolt. You lie dazed for a few minutes before you can pull yourself together, and by the time you crawl through the hatch, your pod is already surrounded by giant, half-human creatures with huge forked hands. They've got some thoughts, a lot of them, about politics, why the Seinfeld finale wasn't that great, but most of all, they have thoughts about safety. So that's where we are, right? Giant, half human creatures, and they just can't wait to talk to us about safety. So, in a true choose your own adventure form, we've got choices. So, if we'd like to talk to these alien creatures about critical controls, and I'm already excited, this sounds exciting, but if we'd like to do that, we're going to go to page 38. If we want to talk to them about Hop versus whatever the heck these aliens have been up to, we can turn to page 47. If we'd rather run back up the ladder through the hatch and lock ourselves in our pod, that's an option as well. We're going to go to page 52. So we've got three options here. I'm going to ask you to get into the chat. Bob's going to keep track of it, I hope. And I'll give you a little bit of time. So get into the chat, and we've got three options, but they're not all the same. Right. The first one is really about maybe implementation. It's the specific things that crop up as we're trying to implement HOP. It's those tangible things you see in the organization. The second one is really more about theory. So we're talking about kind of the theoretical implications. What feels different about this thing than maybe what we've done over this long history of safety? And then the last one, we run away and hide, is sort of about the challenges of these sorts of things, right? The reality of getting down that path a bit and hitting some speed bumps or aliens or whatever the case may be. Okay, so this thing is lighting up for me,
Yeah.
but because I am, oh boy, 38. Look
Yeah,
at this.
you got a lot of responses that are between 38 and 47. I don't see any 52s.
Wow. Okay. No one's running back up the ladder. It's shocking because the pod was so comfortable. Um, Page 38, we're going to go to. So check this out. We're going to see if this works. Now, I have to tell you, there is no page 38. I didn't write you a book. Um, I'm sorry. It's really sort of more like slide 4, but that's fine. Okay. So here we go. Page 38. Uh, we want to talk about critical controls. So here's the aliens, right? They want to know, hey, look, man, when you say critical, like how critical are we talking? I think of this again as it's an implementation thing, right? Remember that we're going to talk to one another. So anytime you want to unmute your microphone, go nuts or put something in the chat and Bob will yell at me and then we'll do it that way. But so this idea of critical controls or even controls save lives, right? The sort of sixth principle of HOP. If you're familiar, 5 principles, uh, sort of a Todd Conklin, probably the most well-known person publishing on those, this kind of emerging sixth principle, controls save lives, uh, a book and maybe some other information coming out of Learning Teams Inc. and Brent and the gang down there. There's, I think, a lot of confusion. And Aaron, if you're on here, credit to you for bringing this up in a conversation the other day as well. I think there's a lot of confusion about what in the world that means. Now, critical controls by itself doesn't sound all that confusing. In your experience, what's critical? This is a test of if you can get your microphone off. What makes something critical? Space alien in a cave?
The last line of defense.
Ah, good. Okay. Last line of defense, that thing that if that doesn't work, we're in big trouble. Anything else?
For us, it's anything that could lead to disabling injury or fatality.
Okay. Dead or disabled, which I think if you're the recipient of dead or disabled, you would agree that's critical. You don't want those things. I think about it as sort of the must go right things that we do. And there's a couple different ways that folks look at this. And I don't want to tell you that your way is right or wrong. I tend to think about it as those steps that must go right. There's another way of kind of thinking about this as an outcome, right? And that outcome is really gnarly, and we back up through those steps that get us there. In that conversation the other day we were having about critical controls, is we tend to get down in the weeds on this. Oh, there we go. Stuff that kills you. If it doesn't work, the bad thing happens. Awesome. I I think we tend to get microscopic on these things sometimes. And again, I'm going to give you my experience from a few hundred different organizations in all sorts of fields where you'll typically find magpies, healthcare, aviation, utilities, those sorts of things. We do some work in other fields. Bob and I were talking about how bad paper mills smell a little bit earlier, but places like that, mining and so on, those high consequence industries, it's easy to get down in the weeds. There's a concept, and it's called different things in different industries, but as we assess risk or analyze risk, if that's the step before that, then we tend to look at the not the worst case outcome or worst case scenario, but the worst credible outcome. And credible sounds cool and it sounds more specific, but I think people argue the heck out of that as well. And the reality is, you sit in this room with folks who are facing that risk, and every damn thing ends in thermonuclear war, right? It it all does. Well, what, gosh, what if this happened and then this exploded and then there's an elementary school over here? I mean, worst credible still gets us down this path of a whole lot of things sounding critical, and then it becomes pretty darn tough to prioritize. So I think maybe a way to get to this without getting microscopic first is that as we evaluate criticality and critical controls, anything we consider in that bucket has to be something that supports our ability to make a decision. If there's no decision that I can make, buy this piece of equipment, don't buy it. Take away this piece of equipment so we avoid that hazard altogether. Or leave it there or guard it or whatever. These are all decisions, right? If we're not supporting decision making, helping people to be right more often, then we're probably heading down this path that stops making a whole lot of sense. Um, excuse me.
Ben, I just wanted to note one comment from James. He says, responding to criticality, when you can't go back to another page in the choose your own adventure.
Excellent. There's no more pages. You're stuck. And I can see Martha on there too. Criticality means something different to us nukes. And I think, Martha, that's a great point. And by the way, there's a lot of really cool people on here, including Dr. Martha Acosta. And if you haven't read her book, go search that thing and immediately buy it. Maybe buy 2 copies and give one to somebody else. Criticality means something different, not just in the nuclear industry. It means something different in any industry when I walk around the building. If I go to enterprise risk management, folks, criticality means something different. Appetite for risk means it means something absolutely different than those of us typically sitting on here. If I go to the maritime industry versus healthcare, criticality certainly has a different connotation. When I talk about critical in a healthcare environment, it means something different, right? The picture in someone's head is different. And I think that that's another issue that we run into with implementation as we're starting to talk about things that are unclear to the user in a lot of ways. Um, I'm curious about challenges that we have the opportunity to talk about challenges at a bigger level, but I'm sort of curious why so many folks picked critical controls. Because if I were to have guessed, I wouldn't have guessed that one. Are you furiously typing?
I have a question for you from myself, Ben, is that
Yeah.
when you're looking at criticality and separating the differences between process safety and personal safety,
Oh.
does that definition of criticality change?
In the world of Ben Goodheart, yes. Yes. Um, and it changes to me again because of the locus of control. And again, maybe just because of a long way around of getting into this safety business, I think about control, not always in the term of controls, but control in the bigger sense of the word. And some of that can be power dynamics, some of that can be system design. But I think about that criticality different, Bob. You mentioned process versus personal safety because of the locus of control. Sometimes at a personal level, my control is I'm bounded in a quite small um, space where I can experiment or make decisions. So I think criticality feels a bit different there. Um, if you pop open a DOE uh, piece of literature, a handbook or a manual, you're going to find different definitions than maybe what I use. But what I can tell you is across industries, part of our issues come from that mismatch in understanding what is critical. And I think a key to that, or a key that we see to that, is knowing how to get the right people in the room for that decision making. What's critical in accounting is a whole lot different than critical at the point of work being done, but both of those things are important. So being able to have that common language, I don't know that critical as a word is the thing that's doing that for us. So I'm going to come back, Bob, to that. Um,
You have a couple of comments from Steve
yeah, I
Smith.
see that. I think
Uh,
going straight to hop is a leap for many. Yes. Better to start with something concrete, tangible like controls. For me, it's the biggest challenge we're currently facing. So, sorry, I'm reading aloud here. People don't see daily activities as critical steps. Ooh, isn't that cool? We tend to we tend to get down into our work, and I can see Steve on here, Steve Smith, and Steve and I share a little bit of similar experience. Steve's way gnarlier than me, but in climbing and mountaineering and being out in what most folks would consider a pretty high risk environment and putting yourself purposefully there. It is the criticality of some of those steps is dampened. And maybe Steve, you've got a better word for this, or even hidden uh, a bit by familiarity with it. Again, I think that maybe that's part of having the right people in the room to have that discussion about it. There was a comment about one of the biggest things that folks face, and maybe a separate comment about starting with controls instead of diving headlong into hop. I do want to talk about that diving headlong into hop, by the way. That second choice, the one nobody wanted to do, that second choice, I think, gives us some opportunities for that. So, look, if I were to get into critical controls and come back to sort of in the aggregate what we're seeing out there as a maybe not, maybe frustration is the wrong word, but as something that takes disproportionate effort, it is that you can create almost a never ending catalog of risks and critical risks and the critical controls that go along with them, and maybe not be a whole lot smarter at the end. And one of the things that I've seen and I want to share with you is when you look at, and when I say old school techniques, I don't mean that in any way other than they've been around for a long time. But when you look at these old school techniques that sort of aren't found in HOP and Safety 2 and so on, fault tree, event tree analysis, sort of more engineering facing, kind of an old school risk matrix, right? The things that you still see out in industry all the time. It is consistently surprising to me to see how much we go back to that gravitational pull of those tools when we start to talk about critical controls. And I think that gets confusing for folks, right? We talk about sticky and an energy wheel. Now, we didn't call it sticky 30 years ago, but there was no doubt that separating people from electrical energy was an important thing, right? That gravity and the risk of injury or death from a fall, this is not new science, right? And so I think that's the danger here, is almost that people see these tools and a return back to the linearity that isn't meant to be there, but is there in things like fault tree and event tree, right? It is not meant to be purely linear. But I think when we talk about critical controls and you see tools like a bow tie analysis, which can be really stinking cool, that stuff's been around a long dang time. And in the same breath, we're talking about how new view this way of thinking is, how HOP is different, how Safety 2 is different, how Safety Differently is, it's in the dang name, right? How it's different. And then we're just going to put another label on some pretty old school stuff. So when we see this out in industry, I think this is the friction that people are feeling, is going, wait a minute. I thought this is the stuff we're moving away from. And what I'm hearing is the picture looks very, very much the same as I start diving into what's the hazard, what's the risk, how do I control this element of it. The thing that pops in my head again is sort of a bow tie analysis. Fantastic tool, but with a comma at the end of the sentence, not a period. And I think this is a bit more confusing than we give it credit for.
Ben, can I catch up on some of these chats?
Yeah, please.
Steve, when you were searching for that word before, Steve came up with normalized, perhaps. And then
Yeah.
James said a graded approach where critical is a level is how we approach a lot of safety related topics, pre-job brief, risk analysis, hazards and controls, things of that nature. And then
Yeah.
finally, Martha says, I went to critical for similar reasons as Steve and CERD, if I can pronounce that correctly. I think it takes critical thinking to identify what's really critical. It's not necessarily the most obvious hazards whose controls are critical.
Yeah. So something I want to point out, and thank you, Bob, for catching me up on that. So there's something that I heard in there, and you have to tell me if you heard it too. There was a description of risks and hazards that are critical, and a descriptions of controls that are critical. So here's another place where we start to diverge, and it's not intentional, right? But if you can show me how this differs from a risk matrix in the Air Force System Safety Handbook from the 60s, I'll buy you a beer or the diet beverage of your choice. It's the same thing, right? When we talk about gradations of risk or gradations of controls, it looks and feels suspiciously like that old school risk matrix. And I think, again, I call it a gravitational pull. I think our brains look at that and we love to think about things in terms of the probability that it might happen and just how gnarly it might be if it does, right? Probability, likelihood, and severity. Um, it is so easy to fall back into that. And we've got a lot of great research that says there are some pretty substantial shortcomings to something like a risk matrix. And we're pushing and pushing and pushing ourselves back to that. I don't think intentionally. Um, I, I would agree wholeheartedly with the statement that controls save lives. I think it would be weird not to. Um, I would agree wholeheartedly that we should be able to identify, or we can identify maybe some controls that are more critical than others, that are a single point failure, where there's no redundancy, where it has to go perfectly, or things go to heck in a handbasket pretty quickly. Ooh, how do you pull?
You have a
Oh,
question?
how do you move past the pull back to the matrix? Oh my goodness. Well, Keanu is going to join us here pretty shortly, and we'll talk about it. Gosh, it's a consultant answer, I guess, but it depends. And and Bob, you know this one, right? But I think if this were easy, everybody'd be doing it. And if it were simple and solved, nobody would have written page 38 on this thing. How do you move past the pull to the matrix? For me, and I hope we can get into this in another sort of choose our own adventure uh, back toward kind of theory. But, you know, when you walk through a matrix with people doing work and you change one little thing, you don't have to show someone or talk to someone about the shortcoming of a two-dimensional risk matrix. They can see it. They can see it. It captures a picture of risk at a specific point in time under a specific set of circumstances. And that's really cool. And I think is worth a discussion if we know the limitations to it. I have never in the history of my work with organizations thrown a journal article on the limitations of a risk matrix in front of a client and had them see the light. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of utility to going through. Again, I keep kind of pulling up Bowtie just because I think maybe it's the most common tool for this. There's a lot of utility in going through those things. And if there weren't, smart people wouldn't do it. There's a lot of smart people on this call, and a lot of us have. I've designed a whole pile of risk matrices in my life. But if they were going to save the world, they've had their chance. So, I think we just have to be honest with ourselves about maybe we've got a chance to talk about priority under certain predictable circumstances, but that doesn't get us to the point to what Dave Woods calls, graceful extensibility. If you want to get into the resilience engineering side of things, and I think you should. Um, it doesn't get us to the point of, okay, if this thing goes wrong, now what? Now the back half of the bow tie can help with that discussion. And I think that's probably where it has a leg up on something like just a static risk matrix. I think asking people at the point of work, and I say point of work, not frontline. I say that on purpose, right? Because the point of work happens everywhere at every level of organization. But asking somebody at the point of work, what has to go right today, or it all goes wrong, is going to get you what's critical. And I don't think you have to make it red, yellow, and green. I think your answer is there. And they're sort of backing into categorization and classification a lot of times as a paperwork exercise to justify the story somebody's already shared.
All right.
So maybe my biggest piece of advice on this whole concept of critical controls is to take it for what it is when people tell you, but to make sure before you have that conversation that when we say critical, we all mean something really similar. And we're all talking in the same way.
We have a comment from Derek, and it says
Hey, Derek.
the question, what must go right, is the most impactful and straightforward way to get people thinking about what is considered critical and what mitigations are in place to ensure overall success without diving into worst case scenarios with low reasonable probability.
Oh boy, sorry. I think it's a statement more than a
Yeah.
question, and it's a lovely statement. So Derek, thanks for making that. Um, but again, yeah, I think that worst, and it shouldn't be worst case, by the way, it's worst credible, although that's worded differently depending on who you're talking to. But the amount of argument and discussion that happens within organizations about what the difference between worst case and worst credible is pretty amazing. The same with their terms like as low as reasonably practicable. It's just fun to say. Practicable, I don't use in a lot of daily conversations. So, your version of practicable is different than mine. And deciding when we've had enough control over these critical things. Again, I think back to Derek's point, that question of what has to go right. What can I not afford to get wrong today? Has to go right, or the world is on fire. And to take that for what it is and to use that to frame what we mean when we talk about criticality in this kind of discussion, knowing that an accountant sees that word as something different. Okay.
Another quick Bob question.
Yeah.
The because I think we play in the same sandbox in a lot of these types of industries, but I've always had a problem with failure modes and effects analysis and the linearity aspects of it, and
Uh-huh.
it's using a matrix to fill in the blanks, but
Yeah.
something that might be critical identified through a Pareto of that, but oftentimes how do you demonstrate the aggregation or a combination of risks that only become critical when they happen together?
Oh,
That's not captured in an FMEA.
it is not. No, FMEA, FTA, event tree, a matrix, even a bow tie. I think to Bob's point, that never-ending combination of things working together. By the way, we're getting closer to being able to model that. So there's some really cool models that can do that sort of thing that let you do counterfactual reasoning. The counterfactuals, if you're into that sort of thing, is the sort of, well, what if this hadn't happened, or what if I do this? Some really cool stuff that'll let you do that. My personal favorite is Bayesian networks, and especially when we get into the non-parametric stuff, will do that. But holy smokes, that's a big thing to try to develop. I do think as some of the machine learning tools become a little more accessible for those sorts of things, we'll all be doing that kind of thing. And it gives us a much better picture of how these things can interact. Jessica's asking me what's on page 54, and I think we should check it out. I mean, it's like regular safety, but in hyperspace. Oh, sorry. We're going back. Okay. If we wanted to, can we move on from critical controls? I've done it already. This is a question to give the illusion of control. Um, if if we're going to talk about another one of these, and I think we should, I think page 47 was our runner up. Does that sound right, Bob?
Good enough for me.
Okay, I'm doing it. All right. So we've said we were going to talk to our alien friends about, we're asking them about hop versus whatever they're doing. We don't know. We've just met these guys. They're terrifying with their forked hands and all of that. And, you know, aliens included, I've yet to find people that like being told that they're wrong. And as we introduce hop, it's sort of hard to avoid that. Steve, I think you had a comment earlier. It said, look, sometimes it's easier to introduce something tangible before we get uh, into the theory of this. Well, we're talking theory right now. And we said, look, we want to talk to these guys about hop versus whatever the heck they're doing. We don't know what they're doing, but where do you start with hop typically? So in your discussions, you're going to talk about human organizational performance. What does that mean? Where do you start?
Hey Ben, it's LaRonda.
Hey,
How you
how are you,
doing?
Loretta?
I'm good. Good to see
Are you going
you.
to tell me where you start?
I am, but I'm going to take you
Okay.
back like over 100 years with it,
Okay.
because one of the things that I picked up in your conversation was about how everybody has a different definition for what this thing is and how everybody's jumping
Sure.
off point is something different. And usually, when I talk to my people about human performance, I take it back to the 1800s with Frederick Winslow Taylor. And I say
Sure.
that that's where it started. So when I saw this about the time traveling, it reminded me of that. And then when you asked the question, because of course you were reading my mind about where do you start with hop, that's where I start with it.
Perfect. And wouldn't that be cool? I don't have a time machine. I think we've established that if I did, I'd be back like driving Knight Rider around just for fun. Um, wouldn't it be cool to take Frederick? He likes his middle name, I guess, Frederick Winslow Taylor, and bring him into the future and be able, because I think he's got a bad rap. You know, but Frederick Winslow Taylor, sort of the superstars of scientific management around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, and trying to optimize how work worked, right? Trying to get the most out of people and teams. You know, we had gone from this sort of agricultural society where everybody's out doing their thing to putting people under one roof and saying, I don't know, let's see what happens. And here was a guy thinking really deeply about it. It's very, very cool. Now, in hindsight, we get to look at it and say, "Oh, well, it was overly linear," and you know, he's trying to add sort of a checklist almost approach to every single thing that people do, and you can't work. Okay, well, we know a whole lot of things today that we didn't know back then. So, Loronda, I think it's a good point is to sort of go back and see this path through safety and how we've gotten here.
Well,
But if we're talking about,
I'm sorry, his
no, no, go for
principles
it.
of scientific management,
Yeah, yeah.
the five of those are eerily similar. I'm just going to say
Shockingly similar.
shockingly similar
Yeah.
to those five that, the DOE handed down to us. So, if anyone's not familiar with it, I would suggest, check it out.
Martha says she likes being told she's wrong because it's the beginning of a fun discussion. Well, again, maybe you run into folks like Martha out there. The overwhelming majority, at least in our experiences, you know, you go into an organization, and if I blast through the door like the Kool-Aid man and just start telling folks everything you've done is wrong, and there's one true path, is these five principles. There's a couple comments about the five principles. Five principles of HOP, probably best described by Todd Conklin, um, although contributions from a whole lot of bright folks out there. We talk about things like error is normal and blame fixes nothing, and the way we respond to failure matters. That context drives how people behave, and that we have to learn. And that's a weird set of things, in that if you disagree with them, you're kind of just an asshole, right? Like, how would you disagree? Is learning is vital? Nah, no thanks. I don't like it. Like, that's a weird. You wouldn't walk into a board of directors and somebody says to you, "Ooh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we like blaming people a lot, actually." And it doesn't hold up, right? At face, it doesn't hold up. It's first principles, and so I think it's super important things. But if Isaac Newton grabbed an apple and just started walking around shouting gravity and throwing apples at people's faces, that wouldn't be particularly helpful either. And gravity and sort of the laws around it, those are first principles in the same way that the principles of hop are first principles. They are a starting point, but they aren't a solution to any of these things. And I think to Steve's earlier point and to some things that a lot of you have said is where we begin to lose people, aliens included, is when we start talking about first principles, but not about what these things look like or feel like. It's really, really, whoa, whoa, got a little wild. Are we back where we started? Okay. It's really weird to say things to people like blame fixes nothing. And if HR is in the room, they go, well, hold up. How do I fire people? Where's my performance improvement plan fall into this, right? Because these things, the legal department sort of functions based on concepts of liability, which have blame encoded in them. So it's really tough to disentangle those things. I think what typically works, and again, if it were easy, everybody'd be doing it, right? What typically works a whole lot better is acknowledging that we're asking people to make this kind of uncomfortable shift toward a lack of control. The mirror image of hop, I suppose, is sort of a tightly controlled version of safety. People follow the rules, and if they just follow the rules, we'd be safe, right? I mean, most of us have been in organizations like this, and yet you're familiar probably with U.S. Airways 1549. Airplane lands in the Hudson. Everybody lives. This is pretty crazy stuff. They call it Miracle on the Hudson. It is miraculous. And yet, if everyone had followed the rules, that couldn't have happened. Couldn't have happened. They made it up as they went. Now, if I make it up as I go and I crash into the Hudson and everybody dies, Tom Hanks doesn't play me in a movie, right? I'm a jerk. I should have never done that, right? So we're asking people to say, ooh, maybe always following this sort of strict artifact of control isn't the best way. And that sounds terrifying. So, as a guy who doesn't like being kicked out of clients' offices all that often, I try to think about this in terms of maybe metaphors or stories, and talking to leaders about things like, look, how'd you decide? You said today you were just going to shut down your email so you and I could have some discussions. How'd you decide that it was okay to shut down your email? Because part of your job is answering emails. So what if someone gets their feelings hurt because you decided to skip that part of your job today? How'd you make that trade-off? And even something so simple as that, I think, introduces the idea that not every single thing needs a tight swim lane. Sometimes it's about building a fence around the property and allowing people to, within reason, sort of navigate that space because we've hired good people and presumably we've trained them and hopefully we've given them reasonably good tools to do the work. So, I think starting with principles, first principles especially, can be difficult and maybe embarrassingly so. I will tell you that although we do a whole lot of hop flavored work at Magpie, I very rarely say the word or acronym hop, and I very, very rarely explicitly mention those 5 principles because I think there's a tendency to alienate folks. If I can walk you into the need for adaptation, I don't have to describe to you via 1 or 2 or 3 principles that this is the one true way of thinking, because it does tend to feel it is not intended that way. It's not designed that way, but it's interpreted in many ways, or by a lot of organizations in that sort of way.
As an
I'm going to
FYI,
flip through.
As
Oh,
an
I'm sorry.
FYI, Ben, we're at the 10-minute mark, but
Okay.
if anybody's willing to stay on, keep rolling.
Yeah. Um, ooh, Martha, man, I'm glad you're here. Control is an illusion. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But it's comforting, right? I've got a 16-year-old, and we're coming to the end of sort of the supervised driving. That means there's like 48 hours that she and I have been in the car. And we moved from a car that had a parking brake handle in the center to a car that only has a pedal for the parking brake on her side. Now, whether that means I will live or die in this process, I don't know. I think, Martha, to your point, there is an illusion that I had any control, that I could yank that parking brake and we'd solve some problems. Um, but it feels it feels useful. And I think the thing that we just can't forget here, and it is really hard because I think in safety we tend to be this really cool balance of empathetic and very, very pragmatic, is we forget to acknowledge that maybe there's even more importance in how people feel than the actual practical application of all these things of safety and risk and so on. I can say those words, but that feeling of loss of control overrides all of that stuff. This is sort of a smart ass comment I put in the bottom of this thing, but the book on the lab table of all the ways I tried to describe safety that didn't make any sense. And I wonder if you've probably felt that in a few ways too. I have had, and I think it's lucky to have had it several hundred times of trying to do this in many different organizations. So hopefully I've gotten better over time. What that translates to when we're hanging out on a webinar like this is there is no one good answer. I'm going to look here again. Uh-oh. Jessica's talking about driving here.
That putting the brake on the parents' side.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that idea of a placebo effect, this is really cool stuff, right? This I think that's a weird line to walk, and it's maybe one of the most difficult things in this line of work that we have to navigate, is that we're trying to acknowledge the placebo effect, those feelings that we're navigating through concepts like HOP. We're trying to acknowledge that while also saying that the placebo effect that we get from a thing like a risk matrix or a JSA sometimes is really harmful. So it's real, it's useful, and it's also harmful. It's a lot of things, right? Is the dose makes the poison. If you don't have enough water, you die. If you have too much water, you die. And that's an uncomfortable space to try to navigate. I think before we get really too close to the end of things here, because Bob will have a few things to say here as we wrap up, is one thing to really be careful of. Again, my experience with a lot of organizations is when we put those 5 principles out and people say, well, I can't really disagree with that, right? Blame fixes nothing. I mean, they have some disagreement maybe, but they're probably not going to voice that. Is there's also a tendency for people to look at that and say, well, we're already doing these things. Learning is vital. We're learning, right? So we've got to be prepared then to say the language has to go beyond those basic definitions of gravity and inertia, right? Those basic first principles, the mathematic equations that design or define our universe. So I think that's, if we were sucked out of a spaceship talking to aliens, the thing that we have to do is talk about what looks and feels different with that approach than what we have today. And I'll come back to sort of broken record style. If we're not supporting someone's ability to make a better decision because of it, we're often wasting their time. right? And you can get down, you can call safety anything you want, right? It is an emergent property of a system. It is the presence of capacity. We hope we're not killing people right and left, right? All of these things are important. But the way that we get to that is we make better decisions. We're right more often. And so if we're doing all of these things and we're not allowing people to go to work and make better decisions because of it, I think we're going to find ourselves with a lost cause. And most managers and leaders, I think if you ask the right questions, will tell you that's a lot of the frustration that they have when they hear something like, error is normal. Okay. And now what do you want me to do? Right. And so it's sort of working back into those things. Bob, have I gotten a few more things here? Oh boy.
Well, Jessica's putting the reminders out about
Okay.
the upcoming things. That's what you probably
Oh,
what
yeah. And some good reminders. Yeah, pop on there, listen to Proven. That's a great one. Resilience Engineering, Mike Rayo, who's at OSU, fantastic. Resilience Engineering, I think, dovetails. It's not the same as HOP. And I think that's important. There tends to be this sort of, since we're talking about principles, right? This sort of mashing together of HPI and HRO and HOP and Safety 2 and resilience engineering. And they all share some pretty cool pieces, but they are not all the same thing. Resilience engineering isn't the same thing as HOP. And I think that's okay to acknowledge. And it's okay to acknowledge not just that, but don't tell anybody I said it. But there are things like behavior-based safety that are not all BS. Right? It's okay to acknowledge that little bits of what we've learned in the 1800s from Frederick Winslow Taylor. I'm not following his manual on how to do everything, but I need to know what worked from that and how we've built to it today. So I think, again, nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. They can be wrong. We just have to be able to navigate that a bit. But if we view HOP as sort of a natural evolution or progression of our way of thinking about safety, and it really is, right? It's radically different than in the 1800s in a lot of ways, although there's some pretty crazy similarities. 5 principles, for instance. It's radically different to think about in the 50s and 60s, that sort of engineering focus through fault trees and event trees and FMEA a little bit later on. But it is a natural progression from those if we're not afraid to acknowledge that some of this stuff isn't as scary as we've made it out to be, right? You read Geller's work on some of behavior-based safety work, and it sounds really close to HOP discussions. And then we love to sort of vilify it, right? Now, I don't want to come across, despite Ron and Dave sometimes picking on me as a tongue in cheek about being a behavioral safety guy. I'm not waving the flag for behavioral safety, not by any means, but I do think it's a mistake as we talk about this theory to say that all those things didn't contribute to where we are today. Gosh, we've got 2 minutes left, so I've blasted through all of this sort of stuff.
Ben, I wanted to get this last question is because I think it's probably relevant to those who don't know you, the very few. Why Magpie is the name of
Oh
your
boy. If you're in Australia, magpies are terrifying. I'm not in Australia. We have very kind magpies here. I live in Colorado, and I lived up in the mountains of Colorado, and magpies are a really common bird up in the mountains here. And they're part of the corvid family. It's sort of universally acknowledged as a pretty smart bird. That's aspirational for me, but here we are. They live in a pretty small area. They got a great sense of real estate up in the mountains, and they live quite a long time. So they become experts, right? They become experts in their environment. And yet every day a magpie wakes up in the morning and it goes and it picks something up and it flips it over. It flies off and drops something. It starts digging around and trying to discover new things. And it does that every day, as long as it lives. It's an expert in its environment, and yet it's curious always. And I wanted something that would sort of describe Magpie's desire to expertise, but commitment to always being curious. And if we lose that curiosity, then I'll just retire and hand it over to Bob. So adaptive and creative. Yeah, very cool. Well, geez, this has been pretty cool. I don't know if it was as cool as an 80s choose your own adventure book, but I had fun. And I'm sure thankful that you made a little time to be here, and extraordinarily thankful to LaRhonda and to Bob and to the community of human and organizational learning. I'm gonna plug it again. If you're not going out to Columbus in June for the conference, get there. It is absolutely worthwhile. You're going to have a ton of fun, learn a whole lot of things, meet really cool people, and I sure hope to see you out there.
Thank you, Ben. And, the community thanks you for taking the time to share this with everybody. You've got a unique educational style in that, you're very approachable. You do it in ways that I don't know of other people do it, so that it's memorable. So this was more like, to me, like a fireside chat where
Sure.
you want the interactiveness, because everything that you said applies to everybody here. And then, when you leave here, you may just end up with more questions, but it made you think, right? So
Yeah.
I think we all face the dilemmas of these words that are left to the interpretation of the people that think what they are, whether it's HOP, or whether it's RCA, whether it's reliability, resiliency. Everybody interprets that the way that they do. And that's because there's no universal definition, universally accepted definitions of these things.
All right.
So Jessica has put in the chat all of the things that are coming up, the fireside chat that Ben mentioned with Mike Rayo,
Rayo. Yeah.
so I pronounce it properly.
That's all right.
Dave Proven is coming up. He's our webinar speaker and presenter for next month, which is getting a couple months before the conference. Jessica also posted about our award competition. There's 2 awards this year, as we had started last year, and we're looking for nominees for the Vanguard Visionary Award, which is essentially rising stars and people to look out for in this niche industry. And the Applied Excellence in Learning, which is, we're looking at not just theory, but when you put this into practice, show us how it was defined as successful, and that we can share so other people can learn. LaRhonda, did I miss anything?
You sure did, Bob. How dare you?
Yeah, I know there was a volunteer one on there. It was a baton.
There sure
It
was.
a baton I was passing.
All right, thanks for the baton. I am absolutely looking for volunteers for the conference. So if you're going to be there, please let me know. We've got some really cool things, as Ben described it, that we can have you to help us out with while you're still enjoying the conference. And for anyone who would be interested in being a sponsor, we would love to have you as a sponsor for the event. Thank you, Ben, for being our very first one this year. We greatly appreciate that. And looking forward to seeing you, Ben, with my t-shirt.
Oh, come on now. I knew it was coming. Thanks again. And my contact information is up here. I promise I'll answer an email or answer a phone call. I recognize that we've made it through an hour and 4 minutes. And if that were enough time to solve all the world's problems, I'd be shocked. So give me a shout if you want to hang out, talk about this sort of stuff. If you're in Denver, stop on by. I'll see you over at the conference in June.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Jessica, behind the scenes. She's our Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, makes all of this possible. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week.